I think everyone always had a sense that there was a problem with the theory of human evolution, and that, if somebody could get in there and to look at the fossils and kind of do a another look at them from a creationist perspective or an anti-evolutionist, perspective, that you might find frauds there. And 27 years ago, my wife and I started that process. We started some film companies and we started interviewing scientists all over the world, including like Dr. Don Johanson, scientists in South Africa, Europe, probably 40 scientists in all. And also then we were allowed to film and photograph the fossils. No one knew at the time that we were questioning evolution. And I wrote up the book on human evolution. I wrote up two books on human evolution. The first one is this book. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's Untold Stories of Human Evolution. And it was basically, it just came out. It's basically a book that covers the Ape-Men that were created out of ordinary animals like pigs and dolphins and horses and things like that. That was the first book, and it's just being released right now. Then I wrote up a second book, which is also being released. It's called The 9 Categories of Overturned Ape-Men. There were 232 species of ape-men that have been overturned, and I broke them down into 9 different categories. But as I was writing the words for the back cover, I started to write out, there were also episodes and examples of fraud in our interviews. And then I thought to myself, well, I should tell them how many frauds there were. I'm just telling you how dumb I am, because I never really thought there were this many. And so I started counting them. And these 2 books had already been written. And as the more I counted, well, he said this and he said this, and boom, it just jumped off the page. There were frauds everywhere. Now, I don't use the word fraud lightly. And I would imagine some of you are questioning, what do you mean fraud? Now, fraud is not a mistake. Like a mistake would be finding a pig tooth and saying it's an ape-man. That's not fraud. That's just stupid or ignorant or, overzealous scientists. But a fraud is knowingly and purposefully misleading, that what you're saying is a lie, that that you're altering a fossil and it's really not justified, that you've changed this diagram. And I was just shocked when I got up to 150, because we had already written these 2 books. The bulk of these are in the video series, which you can watch online at thegrandexperiment.vhx.tv. And the last 4 episodes, these are 50-minute episodes, go over these 150 frauds in detail, very graphically, where I don't really have to show you too much tonight because it is all there. But there's a credibility problem. If I was in your seat, I would be saying, I don't believe this guy. Who is he? What 150? And I feel that before I even start. And so I feel it's important for me to enumerate all 150 for you in the next 50 minutes, and to show you how serious they are, and to show you how real they are, and that this isn't a made-up story. And really, when you add the 150 frauds to the 232 ape-men that have been overturned, to the thousands of mistakes, to the 41,000 overturned ape-man tools, stone tools that were overturned, this is now has enough weight to say, okay, the whole theory scientifically is tipping. I'll just say it that way. I would say it's fallen, but I'll just say for a non-believer, I would say it's tipping, like it's falling over, So here we go. Now, you may wonder why I use the word ape-man in my talk. I don't use the word hominid or hominin, and because it's very confusing. If I use the word ape-man, everybody knows what I'm talking about. An ape-man, according to me, is a creature that's not an ape, and it's not a human, Homo sapiens. It's something between an ape and a man. so simple. I don't use the words hominin, hominid, hominoid, because you lose your audience, and the evolution scientists flipped the definitions of those in 2001. So then you'd have to say hominid prior to 2001. It's just so confusing. I'm not going to waste any time. It's just Ape-Man. And if you have a problem with that, you can insert the word that you want. But here we go. I'm going to tell you 150 frauds. The first one, you're going to be surprised. It is a fraud. And this was the Nebraska Ape-Man found in 1921 and written up in the newspapers in 1922 at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And it turned out to be a pig's tooth. And they admitted that 4 or 5 years later. But that is not the story. The real story was this was a hack job on a creationist. It was a lie, and it was 2 frauds. It was announced in 1922, but in 1908, 14 years earlier, the American Museum scientists that were involved in the Nebraska Man wrote up an article internally within the American Museum called Novitats. And in this article, they made this strange observation. They said, look, at this site called Snake Creek, where they're eventually going to find the Nebraska Ape-Man, scientists should be very careful, because the pig jaws here, if you look at the molar teeth, premolar teeth, they look like human or ape molar teeth. So they recognized in 1908, this is a dangerous situation for making a mistaken Ape-Man, 1908. Fast forward 8 years later, 1916, they found a pig tooth that's eventually going to be called the Nebraska Ape-Man. It was so unimportant to them, they put it on a shelf. Didn't even put it in a museum, just sat there. Pig tooth is just sitting there. Then in 1920, the former Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, a creationist, a highly articulate man by the name of William Jennings Bryan, who was in the Scopes trial. Now, the media has portrayed him as an ignorant buffoon, but he is nothing like that. If you read his talks and his lectures that he was giving around the world, he was influencing tens and tens of thousands of people each time he'd give a lecture. There's pictures of the crowds that would form around him. He was called the Great Commoner because everyone came to hear his biblical message against evolution. But he had the audacity, Bryan, to write an op-ed piece in the New York Times in 1922. And he basically said, look, I think evolution's a pile of junk. There's not enough facts about it. It just, if you want to call your relatives apes and monkeys, fine, but I don't have enough information to believe this theory. And at the end of it, he challenged the president of the American Museum to respond to him. Well, the president was very irritated. He had now to get up in front and defend evolution. And here's this man challenging him. He did. He responded. He gave a response. Both of these are full page on the Sunday edition, 1 week and then the next week. And lo and behold, weeks later, he announces, I found an Ape-Man in William Jennings Bryan's backyard, basically in Nebraska, where he was also a state rep. And he said, look, here's the proof for evolution. There's an Ape-Man in Nebraska right here. He tells the public it was found just the previous year. We just found it. And that was the first fraud. And then when they published like 8 scientific articles over the next 2 or 3 years about this, they failed to mention the fact that the pig teeth from this site look like human or ape teeth. He goes through a whole line of comparisons, comparing it to carnivore teeth, human teeth, human Indian teeth, this and that, every kind of animal you would want to compare it to, except the pig teeth. And that is fraudulent because they knew up front that the pig teeth, that would be the one you'd want to see. I'd say, let's start there. Let's show me all your pig teeth and show me this tooth. He never tells it. It goes on. The Scopes trial. William Jennings Bryan dies shortly after the Scopes trial. And then a couple years later, Osborne from the American Museum says, oh, it was a mistake, and I'm sorry, we messed up here. And then just for a side issue, this isn't a fraud, the president of the American Museum then writes an article in Science and says, let us abandon the theory of humans evolving from apes. He decided he didn't believe it anymore. The scientist from the American Museum. And it's very interesting. You can read about that in my book there, but that's the first two frauds. The next frauds are the famous chart from Time Life, which was these animals. This is what we grew up on, all the great evidence for evolution. It was made by F. Clarke Howell, who we did interview before he died. And it turns out that F. Clarke Howell knew that 10 of these animals were not ape-men. Now, the title of the chart, it's not shown here, is On the Road to Homo sapiens. So it would be going from an ape to modern man, Homo sapiens. But Clarke Howell knew through his writings, or when we interviewed his colleagues, that Pliopithecus was not an ancestor to humans, nor this one, proconsul, Dryopithecus, Oreopithecus, or Paranthropus. He knew those 5 animals were not ancestors to humans, and yet he put them in the chart anyway. And he also knew the last 5 animals, starting here, early Homo sapiens, were all Homo sapiens. Well, you really can't put in 5 Homo sapiens on the road to Homo sapiens. You get 1 Homo sapiens on the road to Homo sapiens. So you take 5 animals down here, that are not ancestors, and then put 5 varieties of Homo sapiens that he's calling Homo sapiens, and that brings you up to 10 frauds. The next fraud I wanted to go over was Dr. Don Johanson, and he actually did 4 frauds. And the first fraud is so stunning that I just find it, I just can barely talk about it. It's so stunning. Dr. Johanson said Lucy, who that's a skeleton he found, walked upright on 2 feet. Why did it walk upright? And he wrote this in his book, Lucid Language. He said, because in Laetoli, Tanzania, there are a set of footprints, and the only animals found at Laetoli, only hominids, are Afarensis or Lucy type. It's kind of a hollow argument. You might not have preserved the human bones, and it was made by human, but it's good enough. I understand what he's saying. And where the footprints are found, they only found Lucy fossils. So Debbie and I jumped in a plane, flew to Tanzania, met with the former director of the National Museum in Tanzania, and said, we'd like to photograph every fossil from Laetoli, all the Ape-Man fossils. And we started out with LH1, Laetoli hominid 1, it was a Lucy fossil. Laetoli fossil 2, it was a Lucy tooth. Laetoli fossil 3, it was a Lucy jaw. Laetoli fossil 4, it was a Lucy skull piece. And when we got to Laetoli fossil 18, LH18, they bring out a human skull. Now, you said that the footprints proved that Lucy walked upright because there was no humans there, and yet there was a human skull found at Laetoli. Nobody knows that, by the way. Johanson also made a full case that Lucy walked upright because her knee was human-like. It was a human-like knee. And I get it. How can you contradict it? Who of us could know the difference between a human and an ape knee, really? So Debbie and I jumped on a plane, flew to Paris, and interviewed his partner at the dig site. His name is Dr. Yves Coppens. And we said, Dr. Coppens, this is shortly before he died, probably of COVID, but Dr. Coppens, the knee joint of Lucy, was it human-like or was it ape-like? I'm knowing that he's going to say human-like because that's what his partner said. And his partner, Johanson, said that all evaluations of the knee joint show that it's a human-like knee. So anyway, Dr. Coppens, what was the knee joint like? And he said, oh, the knee joint is not human-like. It's an ape knee. I was like, are you kidding me? And he was so matter of fact about it. So that was another fraud when he said that all evaluations showed it was a human knee. The third one was the pelvis of Lucy. And I want to show you why that is fraud. This in his book is a picture of his pelvis. Now, a human pelvis, I don't know if you can see this, turns forward, okay? Turns forward, whereas a chimp pelvis turns it doesn't turn at all. It just goes out sideways. And you can see this very well in our book because we've spent a lot of time giving you the pictures to understand this. And you can understand it if you go through the book. And he said, look, Lucy's pelvis is round and curved and goes forward like a human pelvis. Now, we all know that he altered the pelvis and cut it up with a saw and changed it from an ape pelvis, which would mean that he didn't walk upright. You can see this pelvis goes out sideways. Here it is again. It goes out sideways and doesn't turn forward. And here is the side view. It comes out sideways right in front of you. He changed it from the sideways ape pelvis to a human round pelvis. And he did that with a buzz saw, and he did that in the movie In Search of Human Origins on Nova. What made this fraudulent is that whenever he then released copies of his fossil, he did not tell anybody else, unless you had seen the Nova, that this is not real bone. See, this looks like real bone, and this looks like plaster. And you just copied this from this. But the real bone is not real bone. It looks like real bone. He actually cut it here, cut it here, cut it here, put in plaster, and then he painted it to make it look like real bone. And that's fraudulent. And that's what's at the different museums. This cast, and nobody tells you that this is changed from an ape pelvis to a human pelvis. Kind of a problem. Alrighty. And the next one was a man by the name of Ameghino in South America. And you may say, well, who is Ameghino? Why is that even pertinent? Ameghino is the most famous scientist in all of South America. If you fly to Argentina, you'll notice there's schools named after Ameghino. There's hydroelectric dams and lakes named after him. There's parks. He is well revered, but he was a shyster. In 1890s to about 1910, he found 5 Ape-Men, like they're called Tetrapathomo and Homo Habilis and da-da-da-da-da. And he said, I found the evolution of ape to man in these 5 Ape-Men right here in Argentina. The scientist from the Smithsonian, Aleš Hrdlička, flew to Buenos Aires to look at his Ape-Man and talk to him while he was still alive. And Hrdlička, when he picked up the Ape-Man that I'm talking about here is called Tetrapathomo. It was a neck bone from the top neck bone and a leg bone. When he picked up the neck bone, he noticed it was lightweight. And when he tapped it against his teeth, it was soft, like an animal bone that was buried recently. It wasn't fossilized. But Ameghino interviewed the scientist that Hrdlička interviewed the scientists and found that Ameghino had lied. Ameghino wrote that when the fossil neck bone came to the museum, it was embedded in rock. And he then gave 2 scientists that and quoted them saying, this is true. It was embedded in rock. But when Hrdlička interviewed them, they said, no, we never said that. He made that up. We never said it. Came to the museum in dirt like a recently buried human being. It was a human neck bone. The second fraud he committed was Ameghino was the world's expert, so to speak, on procyonids, or the raccoon family. And he had taken a raccoon leg bone and said this was an ape-man leg bone. Well, if anybody could identify a raccoon leg bone, it would be this man. He named two of the genus groups of the raccoon family. And yet he made this case that there were 18 hallmarks on there that it's a human femur, even though it's from the raccoon family. Then the last fraud that I'm going to mention that he did is he picked up an ordinary piece of pumice, that's like the lava rock. You can put it in your garden. Anybody could identify pumice. And he was also a professor of geology at the National University in Buenos Aires. And he said, no, this is not a piece of pumice. This is the remnants of an ape-man fireplace. Now, you just couldn't be that stupid. I mean, that's with all the other things he did, that is fraudulent. And Herdlicka called him out on it and said, it's just ordinary lava rock. It's nothing. He did other things, but I'm not going to get bogged down on that one. The next, I went across North America, then I went down to South America, and I'm going to start in the tip of Africa and I'll work my way up to London. The tip of Africa is the country of South Africa. And there was a guy named Raymond Dart, and he was Mr. Evolution from 1921 when he discovered the Tong child, Australopithecus africanus. And he subsequently found the ape-man that was in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, which is arguably the worst movie ever made in Hollywood. 2001 Space Odyssey had these apes, with using tools. And those ape men in 2001 were called Australopithecus prometheus. And basically, Raymond Dart made this whole thing up. And there's so many lies that the reason I'm calling him lies is I'm going to tell you about his confession in a second here, but they're so outrageous when you look at him, what he's claiming. Like he'd pick up an ordinary animal bone. He said, this is an ape-man tool. He'd pick up a mandible. He said, no, this isn't just a mandible. This was an ape-man scrub brush. He would just make incredible claims. He'd go into a normal cave and said, this is where the hearth was made, where they were smelting iron. Now, all that would just go down as Raymond Dart was just a big storyteller, not a fraudulent man. But we recorded an interview with his colleague, Robert Brain, in South Africa. And Robert Brain told us a conversation he had with Dart at the end of his life, Dart's end of his life. And we have this on camera. It's in the video series, it's in a book. He says, this is Raymond Dart speaking to Robert Brain, and he says, Robert Brain, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. That's what he was. He was just making up stories. And when you read through the mistakes that he made, you can see that he was just making up stories. He just didn't really care about the truth. And, a black bone became the use of fire when everybody knew that they didn't. And so he actually committed 35 frauds, and he was all over the New York Times and Time magazine in the 1950s. He was very prominent. And now, basically, he's a flim-flam man. I got to check my blood sugar. I think I'm low here. Hold on. Nope. Okay. So the next set of frauds were by Robert Broom. And this was Dart's close colleague, but he was at a different institution, the National Museum in Pretoria. And Robert Broom found an animal called Paranthropus. And Paranthropus ended up in that chart of Howell's, but Paranthropus is like Zinjanthropus, and it looks like a gorilla. If you see Paranthropus skull, and the pictures are in the book and the video. It completely looks like a gorilla. It has this prominent face. It has a sagittal crest. It has a small ape-like brain, 500 cc's. But Robert Broom in Nature said that Paranthropus had a human-like face. But in the video, we did this. We take his fossil Paranthropus and overlay it onto a human skull. It doesn't fit at all because the mandible sticking out, maxilla sticking out a lot. But if you take that same Paranthropus and overlay it on top of just an ordinary modern gorilla, it matches almost perfectly. So that was his first fraudulent lie, to say it was a human-like face when it clearly isn't. And number two, he said it had a 1,000 cc brain, as big as the brains of famous mathematicians and poets, and he gave us the names of their brain sizes. And that was fraudulent too, because its brain was only half that size, 500 cc's. The next fraud was by, I want to make sure I didn't miss Tobias, was by Philip Tobias. Philip Tobias did Homo habilis, and he came up with the whole concept of Homo habilis in 1964. But when we photographed his fossils, the type specimen, this is what we found. This is a photograph that I guess I took that picture of the type specimen of Homo habilis. And when I got home, I was looking up in his monograph, and this is the photograph that he published of this fossil. Do you notice something different? This photograph doesn't look that bad until you see the real fossil. This area B here, this was the type specimen of Homo habilis. We went there into to Africa, and photographed it. It didn't seem that unusual, but when I got home and compared it to his picture from his monograph, you notice there's this big difference. B is all fake. It's plaster. Well, you don't add plaster to a type specimen. That's the whole point of a type specimen. People compare the type specimen for every decision made after that. So he adds the plaster to make it bigger. And then A, you don't notice it here, but A is a different color, and it's attached with a straight line. Now this is the outer surface. Below here is the inner surface. You can see when you see the real fossil, A looks a different color. And it's attached by a straight line filled in with plaster. There are other fossils. This is the left skull piece. The right skull piece also looks similar. It looks like he's taking multiple animals and attaching them together. And he actually admitted that in his monograph, that there might be multiple animals that made up this fossil. What he was trying to do was to take an Australopithecus and say, which had a small ape-sized brain, and said it had a large brain. That's what his whole argument was. So this was his first fraud with the type specimen. The second one was he found this skull, these pieces. He assembled it into this Homo habilis skull, and it was assembled by his colleague, and he assembled it based on the pieces fitting together correctly. But after it was assembled, on this left here, the four, he asked the person who assembled it, "Would you make it bigger?" And he said, "No, I'm not going to make it bigger. That's how it fit." And so he asked another colleague, "Would you make this, take it apart and make it bigger?" And you could see how much he enlarged it. He enlarged it about 250 cc's to be his perfect size, to be the Ape-Man that he said it was. And the doctor that made the first skull, we interviewed him, Ronald Clarke, and he said, this is a fraud like Piltdown. So that's the second fraud he did with Homo habilis. The third fraud he did with Homo habilis is this one, OH16. The one on the right is the fossils, how they hook up. And what he did is he spread the bones apart from each other to make a larger skull. He went from 500 to basically a 700 cc skull. And you could see that by right here, these bones attach and he spread them apart. And you just start picking this thing apart. These two bones here attached, but he pulled them apart, and he basically enlarged the skull. The last fraud he did was he and others perpetuated a lie that humans have a brain size of 1,000 to 2,000 cc's. See, they wanted to go from a 500 cc ape-sized brain to a 700 cc Homo habilis brain to a 900 cc Homo erectus brain to a 1,000 cc human brain. But Philip Tobias knew that there were people living and had lived that were normal people that had brains as small as 650 cc's. Daniel Lyon from 1911. And there were other instances of humans with brain sizes of in the mid 500s that were mentally slow to intellects that were in the 700s. The human range goes from 550 all the way up to 2,200, but they kept perpetrating it as 1,000 to 2,000 cc's and made charts, even though they knew it was not that size. The human size covers all of the sizes of the apes, all the way down to, gorilla. So that was his fourth fraud. The next fraud that was carried out was Richard Leakey's, and this will be a surprise to you. The Turkana boy. Okay. Now tell me if you can't see. Debbie and I filmed the Turkana boy original skull. Here is the Turkana boy skull, published by him, black and white photograph of what the skull looks like. I just want you to make a note of where bone is missing, where they had to fill it in with white plaster. But when we got down there and photographed the skull had no white on it. The fill that they used to show that fossils were missing was black. And basically, this was done in Photoshop, as far as I can tell by interviewing Richard Leakey about it, and also the National Museum director, that the fossil never had white on it. And what this does is that it distracts you from this. And I want to show you what the white distracts you from. This separation of the bone. Richard Leakey pulled the frontal bone off of the parietal bone here to make it movable, a movable face. Then he also put in spacer here and here, large amount of spacer. If you look at this on a close-up, and it allowed him to move the face into of Turkana boy into an ape position, because Turkana boy is basically a human, Homo sapiens, human-sized brain. And I confronted Richard Leakey. I said, well, what's going on here? Where's the white? And this seems so prognathic or sticking out. This doesn't seem right. And why did they put spacer in here and all this? And his response again was quite a shocker. He said, no, it's wrong. He said, it shouldn't be like this. It should be more human-like. And then when you go through his articles, you can see how they moved it from the first article to the second article compared to what it is now. So that's Richard Leakey. His father, Louis Leakey, did the same with Zinj, had the skull broken into 3 pieces and stuck out the face. And also Richard Leakey did the opposite with 1470. And you can see that in the video where there were pieces not lined up, which allowed him to flatten the face when it really was sticking out. I'm not going to go into that detail. You can watch the DVD or watch the show to see it, but it's very clear on the show because we have close-ups of all the joints of 1470 and to show you that it was altered. Okay, so that takes us out of Africa. Now we're going to go through Europe, starting in Spain. There was a guy named Louis Guibert who did the Orsay Man. That was the donkey skull. And, it's not a fraud to mistake a donkey skull as
Dr. Carl,
yes.
can you please wait a moment? Can I ask everyone that can you please mute your microphones, please, because we're hearing you in the background. Please mute your microphones.
Yeah, somebody has their microphone open. Thank you. So anyway, Guibert mistook a donkey skull for an ape-man skull. It's called the Orsu Man. Everybody knows it. That could just be plain stupid. I don't know. That's pretty stupid, but I'll give it to him that it was just a mistake. But when he was asked to supply that skull piece so they could do a computer analysis of the bones, he would not do it. And also he would not supply the x-rays, which were needed to do the analysis. He said, look, I'll just draw the skull and I'll show you where the bones meet and show you the lines called suture line. And he submitted it and the computer analysis said, oh, it is an ape-man, even though it was a donkey skull. But when it was pointed out that he had altered his drawing to make it look like a human skull where the bones connect at the suture line, it became a fraud. And in fact, he got accused of fraud in the newspapers in Spain, and most people don't know about that. The next fraud, let's see how we're doing for time. Oh, good. The next fraud is in France, and it's one that's a fossil that's in all the museums now that have human evolution displays. It's called Tumai, or Sahelanthropus chadensis, something like that, Sahelanthropus chadensis. Michel Brunet found this skull and said it was the earliest ape man ever found. And he wouldn't let us photograph his fossils. He wouldn't let us have photographs of the fossils as they're originally found. He wouldn't let us see the CAT scans. And I thought there was something suspicious. So when we interviewed his colleague who found this skull called Tumai in Chad, North Africa, his colleague, Dr. Alain Bouvillain, said this whole thing is a sham. And here's what he did. Number one, Dr. Brunet made the case that it was 6 million years old because it was found embedded in rock and had to be dug up out of the rock, and then they dated the rock. That's a little hokey, but good enough. Alain Bouvillain said it wasn't found in rock. It was laying on top of the sand, and you can't date it because how do you know where it came from and how it got there? And he happened to take photographs of the day of discovery, so you could see exactly where it was laying in the sand. Dr. Bouvillain also said that there was a femur found right next to the skull of the Tumai skull. But in all the museums, they don't show you a femur. He wrote that there was no other bones other than the skull. But here's the photograph taken the day of the discovery, and there's a femur laying right next to the skull. And after 17 years, it came out that he had been hiding it, and that it finally reached Nature magazine. And then someone did an analysis on this femur that supposedly didn't exist, and it looks like a chimp femur. And we have that on our video 8, episode 8, and it's stunning. It looks just like a chimp femur. He also claimed that Tumai's foramen magnum, I'm just going to pick up an ape skull here. The foramen magnum is a big hole. Can you see that? Yeah, the foramen magnum is a big hole where the spinal cord enters on the bottom of the skull. In apes, it's back here. In humans, it's more in the center. And Dr. Michel Brunet said the whole of this ape-like creature was in the human position. And yet, it turns out he moved the foramen magnum. And that's kind of hard to do, you would think. How do you move the foramen magnum? Because there was pieces missing. And you can see it on the computer, and especially on our video, you can see like the way the fossil was found, the way the original CAT scan that was published in Nature, then the, quote, reconstructed CAT scan with the pieces. And you can see that there's more and more pieces missing at each step. And finally, you can see it moves. And so that was his fourth fraud, especially the fact that he doesn't let any other scientists see his fossils. I mean, the evolution scientists can't even see them. And the fossils that are on display of Tumai at the museums don't really match the fossils because he won't let anyone have a copy of his fossils. So that was a great interview. Michel Brunet was not the only French scientist that moved the foramen magnum. The other scientists in France that moved the foramen magnum was I'm having so many brain farts tonight, and I keep thinking it's blood sugar. But anyway, the scientist who found the first complete Neanderthal skull, and Marcel Boule from the Natural History Museum in Paris. Marcel Boule was given a golden opportunity in 1908, because before 1908, they only had fragments of skulls. They never had a complete skull. But in 1908, he receives a complete, nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton that was found at La Chapelle aux Saints. And he was the one that made the whole BS that Neanderthal was bent over, hairy, didn't look like a human, but looked like a gorilla. He was the scientist responsible. And it was fraudulent. And I want to tell you what he did and why I'm calling it fraudulent. A scientist from the Smithsonian, it's the same scientist that visited Ameghino, came to Paris 3 separate occasions to examine the nearly complete skeleton of Neanderthal from La Chapelle aux Saints. He came in like 1911, 1923, and 1926. That means he came by boat, by ocean liner, 3 times from the Smithsonian in the United States to Paris. And all 3 times, he was not allowed to examine the fossils. Well, that's kind of suspicious. It turns out that he portrayed the skull mostly in his skull reconstructed model as complete here, but is actually missing bones all around the foramen magnum. And he moved the foramen magnum on Neanderthal Man, and that's why we had this BS story. He put spacers in there with cork and wax to move it and hold the bones together. And then he said, look, the reason why Neanderthal Man is an Ape-Man is because it's a human, his foramen magnum is more in the 8th position. Well, that was fraud. He also had a tibia of this animal, and the tibia of Neanderthal was just a variant of human tibias. Some of them are bent this way, some are bent this way. But he said, no, this tibia represents that he couldn't straighten out his knee. Neanderthal Man could not straighten out his knee. But in reality, he had other knee bones or tibia bones that he knew had looked exactly like Neanderthal. And these are tibias of modern French people. But he concludes that even though there's modern French people have the leg bone that looks just like Neanderthal, he couldn't straighten his knees. Well, that's fraudulent. And he did 2 other things. Let me try to think of what else. He moved the foramen magnum, the tibia. Oh, yeah. Then he was caught in a fraud where he made a drawing of human neck bones and placed it next to Neanderthal and said, look, Neanderthal's neck bones, the fossils, don't look like a human neck bones. But what he did is he altered the drawing of the human neck bones. And this was not caught until after Marcel Boule dies in 1942 or something like that. After he dies, his successor gets to look at the fossils, and he realized that that also was fraudulent. The neck bones of Neanderthal were human, and Neanderthal was human. And I'm going to move on to the greatest fraudster. I got 13 minutes. I'm going to do it, Danzel. The greatest fraudster of all times was Ernst Haeckel. And I need to just set this up a little bit, who Ernst Haeckel was. When Darwin died in 1882, it left this power vacuum of who is the man for evolution. And clearly that was Ernst Haeckel. He lived in Jena, Germany, and he was producing all kinds of books proving human evolution. But he had committed 68 frauds. Now, how did I find 68 frauds? Well, it so happens there's a book entitled The Frauds of Ernst Haeckel. It's a great book. but you don't have to go to it. If you just watch the video, you'll see them. Here are some of the things that he did. They're over the top. He would take a drawing that he made of a human egg, and then right next to it, he would take the same drawing and label it as a dog egg. It was the exact same drawing. I don't know why people didn't, catch this quickly. And he said, look how close we are to the other animals, our eggs. He would do the same thing with an embryo. He'd have an embryo drawing, and then he would multiply that drawing 3 times, and he'd label it human embryo, dog embryo, chicken embryo. Crazy. And he also made this scheme that I was taught 100 years later, and I'm still mad about it that my professor taught it to me, showing that the embryos of animals in their early stages look like fish embryos. And so we all evolved from a fish. And yet all those were dry labbed. He made those all up, and that came out in 1992 or something like that, when a scientist went back and actually found these embryos to photograph, and the photographs look nothing like that. Now, by the way, he's also the guy that came up with racism, that the black people look like apes, and he's also the guy that started this anti-Semitism, that Jewish people are less than human. And he, at the end of his life, wrote an article in the Berlin newspaper where he acknowledges that he had committed a few frauds. And it's interesting because it was more than few, it was closer to 70. In there, he says, I stand here accused of fraud, and I am ashamed that I did this, more or less. I'm just paraphrasing. But he says, but it gives me great confidence knowing that I am not here in court, figuratively speaking, by myself, because all my colleagues are around me here in the docket, also who have committed these same types of frauds. Hundreds of my colleagues have created these sorts of drawings that weren't accurate. So yes, I did commit a few, frauds, but I'm not any worse than any other evolution scientist. And so that brought me closer to the 150 with his 68 frauds. The last fraud, of course, is Piltdown. Piltdown Man was in England, Piltdown, England, and I counted it up as 5 frauds, and I want to tell you why. It was a modern orangutan, modern human skull, and it was buried at Piltdown, England. But that was one fraud. He made the skull and the orangutan jaw look old by standing up and planted in the ground. By the way, the person that did the Piltdown fraud was a scientist from the London Museum. It was an internal job, and they have admitted that. And that admission also is included in our video when we interviewed there, that it was their scientist, Martin Hinton, planted these fossils. That was the first fraud. The second fraud is he then, because there was questions if Piltdown was real or not, he then placed another Piltdown fossils at a second site about 2 or 3 miles away. He also reached into the museum, took an elephant leg bone off the shelf. I mean, who else could get one? Carved it to look like a digging tool and planted that. So that I considered that his third fraud. The fourth fraud is that he took stone tools, stained them to make them look old, and put them in Piltdown one site. And the fifth fraud is he went through the museum, picking out animals that went extinct and put them into the site so that they would find them, saying, look, this animal, this Piltdown man, obviously is an old man because he's found with all these extinct animals. Added up, it's 150 frauds. My hope for doing this Zoom meeting is that everyone here takes this and creates a talk and starts this ball rolling. I don't know how this message is going to get out. I've approached different media about this and doing a press conference, and I can get no traction. I think it's going to have to come from us, but good enough. That's what we're all here for, and that's what we all do. I would hope that everybody here could develop a talk on human evolution, or 2 or 3 based on this material, and that you would get at it. That's the purpose. Now, as I said, there is a video series. You want to write this down. You can watch the 6 videos without buying the DVD online. And here's the address. It's thegrandexperiment.vhx.tv. There's a rental fee of $10 a video. I'm sorry, but I mean, that's what it is, what it is. Also, the books, the 2 books are available, and these are volume 3 of the Grand Experiment series and volume 4. And these are gorgeous books. I'm gonna stand up and show this to you. These are full color, and all the pictures that I showed you tonight are in there. And I mean, it's just original fossils, and it's laid out so an 8th grader can understand it. There's a teacher's manual for both books. And this thing is printed print on demand through Amazon. In a week from now, you can go to our website and get linked to the Amazon site, but we don't have our website up to speed yet until we announce this. Or you can just search Evolution the Grand Experiment, volumes 3, 4. The last volume in the series is 5, and that's just a bibliography. I didn't think people wanted to pay for a bunch of bibliography pages, but the bibliography, just to show you how vetted this is 432 pages long. So you don't have to buy the bibliography, but if you want to follow the facts down to where these came from, I didn't just quote the book or the magazine or the journal. I gave you the paragraph, so it doesn't look like quote mining, that you can see it in context. I honestly think this is the tipping point when, we have all these mistakes, but now it's fraud. That's a whole nother discussion. And I think it needs to be brought out. And I'm going to need your help to spread the word. I want to open this up because I think it's important for me to take it on the chin and people to say I'm full of bull here in front of you guys. Somebody might have a strong criticism, and I think everybody needs to hear the strong criticism so that, I'm not misleading. So I want to open it up, and Danzil, maybe you could call on people if you see them waving, and call them out by name. If you want to make a comment, you can just raise your hand and we'll try to, okay, I see Dan. Dan, go ahead. Why don't you start?
Yes. So, I mean, Ernest Haeckel's, obviously there's a book written about his frauds, and yet the images, his drawings still appear, as I understand it, in either high school or college biology textbooks today. So it doesn't seem to me that the world is too concerned about the revelation of fraud and all that. So do you see your work doing any differently than other works of exposing fraud, right? Because they're obviously committed to a worldview, right? And rescuing devices are going to be flying left, right, and center. So what rescuing devices do you see coming out to in defense of your work?
Dr. Werner, before you answer that, can I, he has a specific question for you. But he made a statement, as part of that question that I want to respond to real quick, so that will probably help you with your question, with your answer, is that he's absolutely right that they're already known. Some of these things are known, they're well known, and you seem like there's no one making a big thing about it. The reason why no one's making a big deal about it is because we're not. You see, we have the goods. Those are very serious problems. But if we don't make them face these serious problems, then they'll keep on brushing them under the rug or poo-pooing them. It is our responsibilities as believers to make these things the magnitude of problems that they actually are. Whenever we talk to somebody, or whenever we write, or whenever we interview somebody, or whenever somebody talks to us about it, that's the only way we're going to make this thing relevant in our society. Go ahead, Doc.
And actually, Danzo, that is the perfect answer. I think that is the answer to his question, and that's really the point. We have to take this and put it in their face and not let it die. Now, the best thing, Dan, is this Tumai, because it was just on the front page of Nature. It was on the front page of Time magazine, and it's in all the museums, and you could just raise a stink about that. And then you have the goods in video 8 of him just telling these lies, and you can see clearly. So but I think Danzel's answers is right. It's these frauds are there, but we're just going to have to step it up. But now, not with just one or two or five, now with a list of 150, if you believe that number, I think that's fighting grounds.
Amen.
Who
Amen.
else has a
Dan,
question?
Dan, can I go? I have to sit them up about Dan's statement, because he mentioned about the recovery responses that they give. They always have these safety where they'll find
Rescuing devices.
rescuing devices, right? I'm very good with this. I'm very good with the rescuing devices. What the response to rescuing devices is also, because remember, the rescuing devices to take the people's attention off of the actual facts that discredit them. So you don't let them do that. This is like, you can't let them play these games with us. We have to. I've made a list of about 13 different tactics that these people use, and I'm trying to go through each of them to let people know that when you get these tactics down pat, you expect them, and then you know how to respond to them. A rescuing device is not a refutation. A rescuing device is a shifting the goalposts. It's moving person attention away from the facts. I bring them right back to the facts. I say that what you just said does not disprove or prove this point.
Right.
And
I understand the principle, the play there. But my question was specifically, what rescuing devices do you see being employed against your work? I want to know if you thought about any specific ones.
I think over time that they will take down to-my displays. And I think over time they will de-emphasize, like at the American Museum, the human evolution display, they don't even hardly mention brain sizes. And that used to be their big thing, that Homo erectus was, this size and Homo habilis was this size. But now that is what they're doing, is they're just de-emphasizing it and move on to the next unusual name of a fossil. So I don't know. I don't think I'm giving you the best answer, but I think that's what they're going to do, is they're going to just de-emphasize stuff, take displays down, change their displays. But man, these are serious words when you use the word fraud. I consider it very serious. I wouldn't use it because it's libelous, and I open myself open to libel unless there's something you can actually prove to show why you're saying the word fraud.
Great question, Dan. Great question.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
Looks like the raccoon has a question.
Yes.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Hey, this is Joel, not a raccoon, actually. I didn't have any misplaced femurs or whatever. So, no, okay. So my question is, it's similar to the one that was just asked. I imagine the rescue device that would be employed would come along the lines of, well, yes, there are examples of shoddy science in the past, but we've come a long way from there, and our modern peer review is a much more rigorous process. And there is some truth to that. Like 100 years ago, it was kind of a wild west science. What is the most modern example? Would that be the to-my?
To-my would be the most modern example off the top of my head. Homo habilis is just being exposed. That was 1964 to 1990. Lucy, nobody knows about those frauds. Those were from 1974 to 1994-ish, I'd have to think about what the most recent one, but I would say, no, this isn't just mistakes. This is fraud, purposeful fraud, and not just a few. It's more than 100. And it really raises the specter that this whole science is fraudulent based or ignorance based, but not factual based.
Joel?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think, first of all, I thank you for that statement and that question, and add on to what Dan said. You're absolutely right that they will use this. We're a lot more advanced now than we were before, and they'll try to poo-poo it. And this is one of the things I've been trying to say, that I've been trying to get my brothers and sisters to realize, that these tactics that they use to kind of like minimize the seriousness of what's going on. And your point is very well taken. They will just make it seem like, well, we're more advanced than we were back then. But the truth of the matter is that where they are right now, as far as the money that they're getting, the foundations upon which all of their what modern evolution is built upon were fraudulent. And we can't let them get away with just saying that we have to go move with the times. They're built upon a faulty foundation. And a lot of the tactics that they were using back then are still being used today, just more sophisticated. They're still lying today about things. And they are still, I watched Dr. Nathaniel Jensen when he was doing a debate. And I found this with a lot of our scientists, our creationist scientists who are putting out material. When people debate them, you find that they rarely ever read their material. And Jameson, he was in a debate, said, you're debating me and you're complaining about my research, but you never even read my research. And so the point is that they get away with playing games that we let them get away with, and we can't do that. We have to start being sharp, on point whenever they pull these tricks on us, like when you mentioned, Joe, like the one that Dan mentioned. And we have to be sharp as we respond to them, so that those are no longer relevant, no longer useful. We have to take away these weapons that they're using to keep us silent or to make us look like we're stupid for questioning what they're doing.
Joel, I have another point on that too, is there is a delay on discovering the frauds. It's about a 40-year delay, and it takes the scientists retiring or dying, and then the next generation of scientists being able to examine his fossils. But it's a recurrent theme throughout the book and the video series that the scientists won't call these guys out until they retire or until they die. Then they'll reveal the frauds, generally. Also, the reason there's not a lot of modern one is because the scientists hide their fossils. I know that sounds spectacular and that's hard to believe, but if you watch the last episode, episode 8, scientists hiding fossils, we go through starting at the beginning all the way up to the end where the scientists won't let you see the fossils. And it's really a continuum. And I could go through the examples, but I'm not going to waste the time right now. But the modern Ape-Men, the most common ones, we weren't able to film. We're not allowed to see them. Even though we're in a room 20 feet away from them, they won't let us see them or film them, or they'll cancel the interview or something like that because they want to keep their machinery going that they did find an Ape-Man. They don't want some other scientists to find out that it's not. So that there's a big lag here. So most of the time, you're only going to get the older ones because the new ones, those scientists are still active in the community. They know there's repercussions if they criticize them, call them out as liars or whatever. So they don't until once they retire, man, they step up and they start really spouting off on camera.
What reasons do they give for denying access?
You name it. I'm serious. We flew to South Africa to interview the guy who did Laude and Sadiba. And we flew there. We had a meeting set up with him. We're supposed to meet and see the fossils. And when he found out that he asked right before we left, who else are you going to interview? And we said, well, we're going to interview Ron Clarke. And then the next thing I know is when we got off the plane in South Africa, he said, I'm not giving you an interview and you can't see my fossils. And the reason is Ron Clarke said his fossils were not anything new. One was Homo erectus, one was africanus. But the same with Tumai. He didn't allow the fossils to be seen. Same with Eugene Du Bois with Homo erectus, Pithecanthropus. He put his fossils away for 25 years during the most important years when all the debate's going on. He wouldn't let anybody see them. And it's a long list, enough that I made a whole show about scientists hiding fossils because they don't want to be called out. And so it'll never be disproved. You can't disprove them all because you can't even get to the fossils of the latest,
Dr. Carl, I'm sorry you guys for interjecting so much, but this is
I appreciate it actually, Dan.
I'm passionate about this, and I when something like this comes up, I can tell you the experience that I've had, but I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to respond to what he just said about the way that they use these tactics to prolong their relevance. by not letting people see the actual items. And when they do let somebody see it, it's usually somebody that agrees with what they're doing. So our responsibility, and we do have people who are experts in those same fields who can identify whether what they have is right or not. But we have to have access to it. If we don't have access, they can't fight that battle. But we can demand that we are not going to be willing to accept it or let anybody else be deceived by it until someone who are credible are able to examine that material. We're constantly hearing about these new discoveries that they're making, and as Dr. Werner says, they prolong them, and only certain people can see them and write about them, and we don't.
Only their friends. Only their friends. Only their friends can see them.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
the ones who are going to agree with them. Yeah.
So this is the fight that we have to make sure we keep before the public's eye, because the public don't understand this. Another point I want to make is that when the lies are actually exposed, they'll produce the claim massively in all of their major publications and all of their news media and everything, and then when it's exposed as a lie, they put it in the back page of the periodical someplace where you never really hear about the exposure. So the world thinks that these evidences are still the evidences. It's our job. We can't expect them to expose that. It's our job to expose that.
You know, I really like the idea of anticipating strategies, how to answer these guys and how to challenge them, and maybe developing some kind of a training program for all of us to, to get our acts together and know what to do.
Excellent point. Excellent point. I say we do need to do this. And what I've been doing in my spare time is that what I try to do is start cataloging everything. Everything, the old and the new. When I see something comes out, I listen to Dr. Jason Laude debating somebody, or Nathaniel Jameson, or whoever it is on our side debating people. I make meticulous notes about the way we argue against these people and refute them. I keep that in my catalog so that when I get exposed to this stuff, I can respond that way. And I'm not a scientist. And I told Dr. Werner that when I get into some of these atheist scientists, and they say, listen, why am I wasting my time talking to you? You're not even a scientist. I said, the reason why you waste your time talking with me is because what I'm saying to you is getting under your claw, because what you're debating is not me. You're debating the evidence of the scientist that I'm referring to. And that's what I do. That's why I cause them such a hard time, because I'm using these experts like Call's information. And so they're not arguing with me or debating with me, and they can't dismiss me like that, because I'm not claiming to be the one with the source, but I'm giving you these credible sources. We have to start training ourselves to document information, to catalog information, and to make it and go over it so that it's second nature to us. And when we talk to these people who have been making so much progress in deceiving the world, we can actually we can reverse this thing.
I call Danzel my junkyard dog.
Amen. I received it too. Amen. Oof, oof.
Danzel, can we get your email address too?
Oh, sure. DANZ as in zebra, ZILDANZILM @yahoo.com.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And as Carl mentioned, he's written these books. So he has 2 books. One was put out in 2007. I've been sharing that book with anybody who's willing to listen to me. And we carry it here. I mean, so if somebody is interested in Evolution, the Grand Experiment, Volume 1, or you could just get it through Master Books, or Carl, if you have it there, I don't know. And then they have the second volume, Living Fossils. So I read that book back in 2007, and it really changed me, because now I was really able to debate with these different atheists, and I am of no intellect, just so that you know. So everything I hang around with a lot of creationists, I work for Jason Lyle, and, I'm definitely not as smart as he is. Master Books even has a teacher guide. So, you could use it as a class, and teach people, and I love it. I carry around my book. Every doctor's office I go to, I walk in there with this, because they're just nosy and they want to see what I'm reading. And there's Darwin's face on there. And I love challenging these doctors. I know they all went through medical school. They all had evolution. And I love just to, have a it's great conversation started, just to get them talking, find out what they believe, and, just get them to think through some of their thoughts. And that's all we could do, because we know God's the one who's going to do all the work, but he could certainly use us to help them along the way.
That's right. Carl wasn't always a creationist.
I know.
He a lot of people who are now in this battle were once atheist unbelievers, and yes. they were provoked to do their research by having questions and being challenged.
Right, right.
So
Well, that's
that
what I
can still
share with
happen.
people. I love the fact that Carl Werner was an evolutionist,
Amen.
so he knows your side already. He's
You
been
know
there, done
why?
that.
You know why I was an evolutionist? Because of Ernst Haeckel. Ernst
Wow.
Haeckel's frauds.
Yeah.
That was the evidence that convinced me, in medical
Yes.
school. So,
Yeah.
oh, there we go
To
back
this
to the
very
fraud.
day.
Hey, I have another question for you, Carl, if you've got time.
Oh, I got all the time. I just don't want to hurt me about
Okay.
it.
So this is Joel again. So my question is, there's this, we get a lot of claims and evidences from the evolutionary worldview, and there are two approaches that we take as creationists. Both have their place. One is to explain the data away, and I think that's kind of what we see here, where we explain the data as, well, this is fraudulent. This is not even real evidence. But then sometimes they do put things forth that are legitimately scientific in the sense that here is this skull or bone fragments that don't quite look like a modern human, but they also don't look like a modern ape. So what examples of that did you come across? Ones that we have to explain as a creationist because they are legitimate scientific claims.
Thank you. This talk today was just about the fraud. There's like 4 more components to this book series and the evolution series, and I didn't want to go off the tangent because there's so much to do. But I took pictures of the Homo erectus skull pieces and then laid them next to American Indians, Australian Aborigines skull pieces. So you can see that these strange skulls that you're talking about, Joel, that are very confusing, once you see them right next to the skulls of modern humans, where you've looked for skulls that look like that, there's the explanation. Hey, there's people today that look like Homo erectus and that look like Neanderthal. And here are, on this page, this is book 4, here are 12 skulls, and you tell me which ones are Homo sapiens and which ones are Homo erectus and which ones are Neanderthal. And so that is a very powerful tool. I didn't want to mention it because I didn't want to get off my track,
No, that sounds fantastic.
Great.
That sounds like exactly the sort of thing I was asking about.
Yeah, because
Thanks for mentioning.
when you walk into the American Museum, they show you these compelling skulls and you get overwhelmed, but you just almost have to step back and say, okay, let's do one at a time, Homo erectus, and then, okay, let's compare it to all these other animals. And just like the Homo erectus does look like the Australian Aborigine. And you place them side by side, it's stunningly close. Yeah.
Great
Dr.
question.
Werner,
Great question. Who, Dave?
what's the website for the episodes again?
Okay. The Grand Experiment, no spaces, the Grand Experiment dot VHX, that's V like in Victor, H like in hell, and X like in X-ray, dot TV, the Grand Experiment dot VHX dot TV.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Joel, I really appreciate the questions that you've asked. Very, very poignant. I really appreciate them because that forces us to think on this high level, so that we'll be able to respond to these people and their tricks. As Carl said, they have a way. Remember, a lot of the science is not really based on scientific proof, but it's basically on opinions, really based on a person's interpretation of what they see. A lot of science is like that. And we have to understand that that's where their power is at. But if they can interpret something the way they want to support their views, we can interpret it the way we want to support what we see. And we have the greater foundation. So I think that, as Carl was saying, we have to really understand that their power is in being able to say things that are not true and claim that they are true, even without having any kind of evidence. And we have to recognize that that's the way they are. That's practice. You see them videos that Carl was talking about. The video series is phenomenal. After watching those videos, I thought I knew how fraudulent they were and how untrustworthy they were. those videos took it up a notch higher. And it made me so much more confident about when I'm talking to these people that I can't let them snow me or make me feel like I'm stupid for questioning what they do, because they have a history of lying. They have a history of interpreting things the way it would make them look like they're telling the truth. And I said, we got to stop letting them get away with that. We really do. So I thank you, Carl. I think Dr. Jason. I think all of these scientists on the creation side, all you that are involved with creation ministry, y'all are my peoples, man. Y'all are my peoples. And I'm telling you.
Carl, you were on the, you came to one of our meetings when,
Yeah, he
when
was.
Joel spoke.
Joel was
Yeah.
there, yeah.
Yeah.
I think he's
Yeah.
from Brown University. Joel, are you from Brown University or something?
Cornell University.
Cornell, the guy's from Cornell. He's sitting here. Okay. All right, Sue, right. What is your question?
Well, just about the resources. I've read the book on my computer, seen the DVDs, and it is a beautiful book. Did you say that it's available in hard copy?
Yes. So,
Awesome.
the publishers turned me down, and I think it's because there's a problem with selling books. It's all, everything's going digital, and, spend $70,000 to print a book. It's very expensive for them. They didn't want to do the investment, which would have been, $150,000. So I thought I was sunk, but then I put it out, both of these books. First, I put them on Kindle, but then Kindle says, do you want to print the book? And I was like, I want to print the book. But here's the problem. The softbound book, I actually think it's worth it, but it's so pricey. It's like $40 on Amazon right now. But the good part is you can order it anywhere in the world, and it's printed in that part of the world. So it's $10 more than I would have expected, but it comes in softbound, all color, hardbound, all color. And so, yes, you can, if you're a paper person, it is available.
That is well worth the price.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. It's pricey because they print one at a time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But if that's the way you need to do it, get it out there, man.
And the
And is that volume 3 and 4?
Here's volume 3. I don't have volume 4 in front of me in paper version, but it's out in paper and hardback for $50. And same with volume 5, the bibliography. It's all available in paper version, softbound, hardbound, and Kindle. The 5 isn't available by Kindle.
Okay, and by going where?
If you check my website in a week, we'll have it refreshed. But you could just go to tonight. You could go to Amazon.com or whatever, Canada, and just type in Evolution: The Grand Experiment, Volume 3, Volume 4, and then if you want the bibliography, Volume 5.